I'm an archaeologist and also a biological anthropologist. And for the past 10 years, my main research topic has been on trying to understand food in the past, ancient diets, how people ate, and more recently working with the microbiome. A little bit of background, I got my PhD at Harvard. I did my postdoc at the University of Zurich's medical school in their evolutionary medicine program. And like I said, I've been researching diet from many different perspectives for many years, ranging from working with archaeological collections, herbaria, going and working in ethnographies and markets. I even edited a book called Method and Theory in Paleoethnobotany. I'm very interested in particular in developing the methods and tools we need to understand how people used food in the past. And for the past 4 years, I've been directing the country's largest ancient DNA laboratory. This is at the University of Oklahoma. And we've been focusing on different substrates that preserve in the archaeological record that can tell us directly what people were eating. One of the things I've been focusing on a lot in recent times are ancient microbiome preserved substrates. So, for example, the dental plaque on your teeth calcifies during life, forms tartar. This we call dental calculus, and it's this amazing resource that we can then use to investigate all sorts of things about what you ate. It entraps things like starch granules. This is a starch granule from a pea. Also, little bits of DNA of the food that you ate. And we can use this to go back in time and directly investigate what ancient cultures were consuming. I've also been pioneering a lot of new methods in proteomic investigations of the past. We can take that dental calculus again and use it to trace things that otherwise are completely invisible in the archaeological record. I have a large study where we've been using this to trace the origins of dairying back into the European Bronze Age. And we studied this in a lot of different populations ranging from Bronze Age northern Italians all the way to the Vikings, which you see here on the bottom. I work in a lot of places in the world, not only in Europe but also in Asia. I have a project in Nepal where I've been looking at the earliest peoples to colonize the Himalayan mountains. This is one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and it required a range of cultural, dietary, and genetic adaptations to survive in this very difficult environment. And most recently, I've also been working with traditional peoples around the world to try to understand traditional subsistence strategies. For example, working with the Matses, which is a hunter-gatherer group that lives in the Peruvian Amazon. And we recently published a gut microbiome study on them. And then even more recently have been working with indigenous communities closer to home in Oklahoma, where I'm from. We've just finished a large partnership with the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes looking at standing variation in microbiome diversity and its relationship to diet. So I bring all this up to emphasize that I care an awful lot about diet, and I've spent a lot of my life studying it. It's really amazing to me when you think about how much our diet has changed in very recent times. So we've gone from eating out of environments like this to this in fewer than 500 generations. That's an awful lot of change. Because of that, it's been argued that these very lifestyle changes that have occurred over the last 10,000 years may be the source of many of our chronic illnesses today, like obesity, type 2 diabetes, this rapid dietary change that we have undergone. And so I was asked to come and talk today about the paleo diet, in part because it is a diet that explicitly calls to the past to justify the nature of the diet. And its basic premise is that it's this disconnect, which is the cause of diseases of civilization. It explicitly uses the language of nutrition science, anthropology, evolutionary medicine in many of its claims. There's a wide variety of paleo diets that are out there, by the way, so I'm just going to refer to them all as a paleo diet, but they have different names. Things like the paleo diet, the primal blueprint, the new evolution diet, and my favorite, which is Neanderthal. But they all promise that you'll lose weight, that you're going to do things that your body's designed to do by eating this paleo diet. You're going to reprogram your genes, which I guarantee no one can do for you. It's an evolution diet, and you can eat like a caveman. This is a very popular, very fast-growing fad diet. In fact, in 2013, it was declared the year of the paleo diet. And the idea is that if you follow this, you'll be happier and healthier. And I'm really interested in the types of imagery that goes along with it as well. There's this very active and intentional call to hypermasculinity. Almost all of the images are of men. Typically, the sort of advertising involves stacks of meat. It's very meat-focused. If you really boil it down, the kind of what the basic tenets of the paleo diet are, the basis of the philosophy is that agricultural diets are terrible and the cause of most of our chronic illnesses today. And that these problems started 10,000 years ago when agriculture began, and therefore the only way to overcome it is to eat pre-agricultural diets, meaning foraging or hunting and gathering diets. And in the paleo diet formulation, those diets were very meat-focused, had a very strong meat influence, also included things like vegetables and fruits, but definitely did not include things like grain or legumes or dairy. And then finally, the final basic tenet is that if we could just achieve that goal and eat these ancient Paleolithic diets, all of these problems would go away, and we will live longer and be healthier. And so that's the basic premise here. And so, as an archaeologist, what I'd like to come here and talk about is that this vision of the paleo diet, of ancient human diets, as promoted in popular books and on TV and self-help websites, and in the vast majority of popular news articles, really has no basis at all in the archaeological record. And so I'm done. So thank you for coming. But usually people want me to explain kind of what I mean. Like, what do I mean when I say it has no basis in the archaeological record, and where does this come from? So let me kind of go over. There are three main myths that I think are really promoted by the fad diet, the paleo diet, and I want to kind of bust them here. This is important to me because obviously I study ancient diets. I care very much about diets. I care very much about diets they were eaten during the Paleolithic and during the agricultural period. And so I'm very invested in getting this right. And so I want to explain why this paleo diet, where it goes so wrong. So the first myth that it really promotes is that humans are evolved to eat meat and that Paleolithic peoples consumed large quantities of meat. What we know is that actually the vast majority of human anatomical, physiological, and genetic dietary adaptations are actually for plant consumption. So there's many examples. I'll just give you a few here. So for example, humans, unlike most other animals, cannot synthesize vitamin C. That's why it's a vitamin for us. We have to consume it in our diets. We actually lost this ability relatively recently with the divergence of the great apes. Our gastrointestinal tracts, in terms of their anatomy and physiology, are extremely different from carnivores. We have much larger gastrointestinal tracts. They're much longer. That's because we need that extra space for plant digestion. We need expanded room for the microbes to digest our food. We also don't have we have a very generalized tooth dentition for a very sort of generic dietary strategy. We do not have carnassials like carnivores do for specialized meat consumption. We also have a lot of really interesting traits, like we have Tri-Chromatic Vision. If you don't know what this means we can see the colors red and green. Most animals cannot, carnivores cannot, your dogs and cats cannot see those colors. We can. This is a trait that we acquired during our primate lineage, specifically to be able to identify fresh, young, green leaves and red fruits. One of the most interesting genetic adaptations that humans have, which I think is really fascinating, and it actually was selected upon at least 3 times in our evolutionary history, is the expansion of our amylase genes. So amylase is an enzyme that we use to digest starch. And what's really interesting is that virtually all animals have the gene for amylase, and it's expressed in the small intestine by the pancreas. And what's interesting about us, though, however, is we also express it in our saliva. This is something that happened in our primate lineage and stuck with us. It was a retroviral conversion. And so we express salivary amylase in our saliva so that we start digesting starch almost immediately from when we eat it, so that by the time it hits our small intestine, it's already at a fairly advanced state of digestion and we can absorb those glucose molecules even faster. It's why if you take a saltine cracker and you put it in your mouth and you just do nothing but sit there for a few minutes, it eventually turns sweet. That's the action of your salivary amylase. Now, that happened early in our primate lineage, but then much later it happened again. What happened was we duplicated that gene. All humans have more copies of salivary amylase than all other primates. This seems to have happened on the specific human lineage. It seems to be very specific to our evolution and the evolution of our species. And then it happened again where there was another gene expansion in salivary amylase. This is correlated with expression levels of amylase in post-agricultural populations that had a high reliance on carbohydrates. So at least 3 times in our evolutionary history, we have expanded our ability to digest starch. And finally, although we don't really have very many adaptations for meat consumption, there are at least 5 populations that do have adaptations for dairy consumption, which is quite interesting. All of them are very recent and likely post-date the Bronze Age. Now, one of the problems with the paleo diet is its emphasis on meat, and there's a little bit of disconnect here between if you're actually reading the books versus the sort of advertisement. Oftentimes what you see in the advertisements are big, hunking beef steaks, which is just a complete fantasy. In the archaeological record, Paleolithic peoples would not have had access to this sort of meat. Most of the things that they would have eaten would have been small game, it would have been quite lean, and also muscle meat was often not the most desirable part of the animal. Organ meats would have been targeted, especially liver, because it's very high in vitamins, and also things like marrow, which is an excellent source of fat and oil. But people around the world would eat what was available to them. So for example, in coastal Spain, people hunted porpoises and dolphins. People in temperate forests would have hunted deer. It was extremely regional in terms of what was consumed. So where does this meat myth come from? It comes from several sources, and I'm going to kind of break them down, where this idea that Paleolithic people ate a lot of meat comes from. So one of them comes from this subset of archaeological studies or methods called stable isotope analysis. And this is a really widely used method. It has advantages and disadvantages. One of the things it's used for is to try to estimate the relative proportions of plant and animal consumption in a diet. The way that this works, it has to do with measuring stable isotopes of nitrogen, and the idea is that as you move up a trophic level, the relative amount of the heavier isotopes of nitrogen increase, and this is because you preferentially excrete lighter isotopes in urine. And so a lot of people have focused on this, especially in ecology. They use it to look at the number of trophic levels, for example, within a pond or within an ocean or something like that. It's been applied to people and to the archaeological record, and the idea here is that atmospheric nitrogen has an isotopic value of 0, and with each step up a trophic level, the relative proportion of heavy nitrogen increases by about what's called 3 per mil, or 3 1,000ths. I'm just going to kind of gloss over this a little bit and just be really simple, but I think it's instructive to understand where this can go wrong. This is a really simple model that's applied to many ecologies. The idea here is that plants, because they are taking up nitrogen that's in the soil that comes directly from atmospheric nitrogen, have very low nitrogen levels, or this is nitrogen isotopic ratios. The animals that eat them, the herbivores, then have a slightly higher nitrogen isotopic ratio, and then the carnivores that eat them are even higher. And so the idea is that you can look at this, the isotopic ratio of nitrogen, and infer an organism's place in a trophic level. And where this idea that humans are carnivores comes from is the fact that if we take human bone collagen and we measure its isotopic value, it'll fall somewhere right around here. It seems to overlap with where we see like wolves. So this has been taken as an example of humans being these top-level carnivores. But the problem is that ecologies are generally much more complicated than this, and we don't have to look very far to see examples. So if we look at some other natural human populations that are around today, we can see some very strange and interesting patterns. So take this one right here. This is data that was collected in East Africa. And you can see some interesting patterns here. So we have our zebra, which falls where you would expect with the herbivores, and we have our lion that falls where the carnivores would fall. But you'll notice there's actually a little impala here who's actually higher on this scale than the lion, and yet we know that it ate no meat whatsoever. And then humans are actually completely off the charts. So it turns out, and I mean above lions, there's no way that any human on Earth has ever eaten more meat than a lion. It's impossible. So what's going on here? Well, it turns out that these trophic level shifts can really undergo massive changes if there's water stress. And of course in East Africa there's often drought and there's very little access to water. And so during urine recycling this can really alter these values. So that's what's happening here. We get these highly skewed values because of the way people are using water. So we can go to another ecology. Let's say the ancient Maya. We know the ancient Maya were one of the largest consumers of plants. Unless you were part of the very elite class, you had virtually no access to meat whatsoever. And yet if we look again at the bone isotopic ratios of the ancient Maya, we find that actually they fall in the same range as jaguars, and that's clearly incorrect. It's clearly they are not at that trophic level. If we look then just at wild animals during the Pleistocene, we also see some very odd patterns. We see that elk, for example, fall extremely low. It turns out that's because they eat lichen, which are a little bit different. We find that the wolves are a little bit higher than them, but what's amazing to me is that mammoths span 3 entire trophic levels. We have never heard of a carnivorous mammoth before, and yet if you only looked at their isotopic values, that's what you would assume that they were. And so then when we put sort of Paleolithic humans on this chart, they're high. It's true, their nitrogen isotopic values are high. They look like carnivores, but when you take into account the sort of broader ecology, you realize that there are so many uncontrolled values here that there's very little we can say about what they mean. The other place where this idea comes from really is from Lorrain Cordain himself, who founded the main, most popular version of the Paleo Diet, called the Paleo Diet. And a lot of his ideas really stem back to this publication. It was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2000, where he performed a study, kind of retrospective study of hunter-gatherer societies to try to determine what would be a Paleolithic diet. So in this study they did a number of things. So he did a retrospective analysis of ethnographic data on the relative proportions of plants and animal subsistence patterns in hunter-gatherers. He made a number of assumptions, and this is really important in this study. He assumed that by studying modern hunter-gatherers, it would be a good way of reconstructing diets of pre-agricultural human ancestors. And then he argued that those diets of these modern hunter-gatherers could be used as a reference standard for modern human nutrition. And after analyzing these populations in his study, he concluded that hunter-gatherers consume high amounts of animal foods, basically as much as they could in their environment, and that most hunter-gatherer societies derived most of their subsistence from animal foods, and that there were very few societies that derived their nutrition primarily from plants. Now, what's really important to know about what he was doing was he did not actually interview any hunter-gatherer groups. All of the data comes from this, something called the Ethnographic Atlas, which was largely put together in the 1960s by a man named George P. Murdoch here. One thing I love about it is it's entirely encoded on IBM punch cards, which is really exciting. So what is this Ethnographic Atlas? This is really amazing. I mean, for the 1960s, this was a huge achievement. George P. Murdoch was an anthropologist. He was very interested in cross-cultural studies, and he wanted to create some sort of way of comparing cultures in some sort of systematic way. And so he went through, he scoured the literature, he found every ethnography he could possibly find on any human society, and he collated them together. The problem was he was not very picky. He took anything he could find. He took conquistador accounts of the New World. He has missionary accounts of Africa. He has professional anthropology reports. Everything ends up in the Ethnographic Atlas. And then what he did is he took these ethnographies, which are text-rich, they're descriptive, they're stories in many ways, and then he numerically coded them into what you see here. So this is the actual IBM punch card, and this is the sort of coding system that he used, and it's highly reductive. So just to give you an idea of how this works, he looked at all of these ethnographies, and he divided up the different ways that people ate into things like gathering wild plants and small land fauna, hunting, trapping, and fowling, fishing, shellfishing, etc., animal husbandry, and agriculture. You'll notice that none of these subsistence groups are strictly plant eating. So the one that is related to plants, gathering wild plants, is already lumped together with animal consumption. And then he created a series of scores, whether or not each population was 0 to 5, 6 to 15% dependent, and so forth. Now, in almost none of these ethnographies did anyone actually weigh any food or quantitatively measure the types of foods people ate. He simply read the ethnography and then, based on what people said in these very diverse accounts, tried to estimate approximately what would characterize that population. And so this is just an example of some of the data in this table. So here we have at the top the Kung population of Africa. This column 7 is the actual data that was used. So the first number here is this hunting or the gathering wild plants of small land fauna. He gave that a score of an 8, so a 76 to 85% dependence. The second number is a 2, so hunting, trapping, and fouling. He gave that a score of 2, which is 16 to 25% dependence, and so forth. And so that's how this was scored. And this is ultimately the data that Lorraine Cordain used for this article, although he, by this time, was able to get it on CD-ROM. All right. So if we look at the original George P. Murdoch data, one thing that's really interesting is he actually has fairly good coverage of the world. So if you break down the number of ethnographies that are from different continents, it's actually fairly evenly distributed. That's pretty amazing. However, if you look at the subset of hunter-gatherers that went into the study that Lorraine Cordain performed, it's enormously skewed towards North America. In fact, almost all of the societies that went into this analysis are from North America, and if you break that any further, they're almost all from the Arctic. So it's not that surprising that what he found was that hunter-gatherers consumed large amounts of meat because he primarily surveyed areas that have no plants whatsoever. Now, what's also really interesting is that when he then wanted to convert these numbers from percentages or proportions of plants and animals to actual caloric values, he needed some sort of model diet in which to do that. But rather than using, for example, the foods that these populations ate, he took as his standard Aboriginal Australians, which seems a little bit of a random choice, but that's how he did it. And then when trying to model the caloric values of the animal products consumed, again, he did not use the products that were actually consumed by the bulk of the populations in the study, which would have been sea mammals and fish. Instead, he used white-tailed deer, which is much more common in temperate regions of North America and Europe. And none of these diets resemble in any way those that are still eaten today by hunter-gatherers in Africa, which these people live in ecologies that are actually most similar to the ones in which humans evolved and still eat many foods that we know were very important during human evolution. Now, one thing that always really amazes me is that all of these problems were actually brought up in the same issue of that journal by a woman named Catherine Milton. She's a very famous primatologist and anthropologist. In that same issue that article was published, she wrote an editorial critique, and she said that it is clear that the modern hunter-gatherers in the Atlas are biased towards the populations living in marginal environments. These are environments where hunter-gatherers had been pushed to. Basically anywhere that agriculturalists could not grow their food is where hunter-gatherers were living when these ethnographies were performed. So of course they're extremely biased, and extremely biased towards the Arctic. These Arctic regions where most of the data comes from were not colonized by humans or human relatives 2.4 million years ago when humans evolved. And the areas that most of the data comes from actually weren't even colonized till about 15,000 years ago. So she says that, they purport that a high animal, low plant diets are more natural and that health will be improved. People adopted these diets. But on top of those previous problems, the meats and the plants available to hunter-gatherers are very different from those available today to us in globalized societies. Seal and beef are not equivalent and they're not interchangeable. And the energy expenditures, of course, between hunter-gatherers and agriculturists are not similar, nor are total caloric intakes. So lifestyle must be taken into account. And so she set out all of these different critiques. She also pointed out something that I think is really interesting. She said that regardless of the proportion of plant versus meat consumption, no hunter-gatherers in the world appear to suffer from the so-called diseases of civilization. Yet all of these hunter-gatherer societies, when switched to Western diets, whether forcibly or voluntarily, develop the diseases of civilization. So there's something clearly else going on here. Despite this, this article went on to kind of give birth to many, many successful paleo diet books. And like I said, 2013 was hailed as the year of the paleo diet, in spite of these really serious and quite strong critiques that have been around since the very beginning. The other myth I want to kind of burst right now is that the idea that Paleolithic peoples did not eat whole grains and legumes. Now, they did not eat them in the quantities that subsequent agricultural populations did, but they certainly did. We have a great deal of evidence of plant use and plant consumption that far predates agriculture. The reason agriculturalists focused on things like grains and tubers and things like that was because the people had been eating it for quite some time. So this is just one example of a grinding stone. It's about 30,000 years old. It's from Europe, in which starch granules have been found for various tubers and grains. We also get a lot of information, as I mentioned before, from dental calculus, this calcified dental plaque on the surface of teeth. And as these methods expand and we're getting better and better at identifying plant remains in the archaeological record, which are much more difficult to identify because they break down much more easily than things like bone, which are mineralized, which preserve for very long periods of time. But as our methods improve to recover the biomolecules, the microfossils, and the various other DNA and protein traces of plants, the more that advances, the more that we find. This is a really interesting study that came out a few years ago. It was on different starch granules that were recovered from dental calculus from Neanderthals, in which a wide variety of plants were identified. These starches belong to things like fruits, a variety of grains, including a progenitor of barley, as well as legume starches and a variety of tubers. What I'm going to talk about briefly next is what we do know about real paleo diets. I really like Catherine Milton's work, and she, I think, sums it up really well here. She says, humans are not self-made creations dietarily, but rather have an evolutionary history as anthropoid primates stretching back millions of years. A history that is shaped by their nutrient requirements and digestive physiology well before they were humans or even proto-humans. And so the first thing we need to define when we talk about a real paleo diet is, well, when? When do we mean? When is the paleo? Does anyone even know? When is the Paleolithic? What are we even talking about? How far back do we want to go? Do we want to begin with the origins of primates 65 million years ago? The world was extremely different then. Or maybe we mean the split between New World and Old World monkeys. This is incidentally when we developed Tri-Chromatic Vision and we have the first expansion of our Amylase genes. Or maybe we mean when the great apes split off from the other Old World monkeys. This is when we lost our ability to produce vitamin C because our diets were so rich in it from our plant-based diets that we didn't need to consume it anymore. Or maybe we mean when we split from chimps about 6 million years ago, or perhaps when the first Australopithecines appeared about 3.9 million years ago. Or maybe 2.5 million years ago when the first member of our own genus Homo appeared. So do we mean this little period right here? And even if we mean that little period right here, this being defined as the Paleolithic, meaning the period during which we find stone tools, changed dramatically through time. So I've just put up a climate model here. This is based on ice core data of how climate changed over the past 2.5 million years approximately. When the bars go above the line, those are warm periods. When it goes below the line, those are cold periods. When those cold periods get big enough, like they do during the late Pleistocene, during the last 900,000 years, we call those ice ages. So if there's one thing that is constant about the period of human evolution is that it was constantly changing. It does not make any sense to talk about one paleo diet. There were many paleo diets, and it changed through time. Our species first appears right about here, somewhere between 200 and 100,000 years ago. This is when the second expansion of our salivary amylase genes occurs. By 50,000 years, we start moving out of Africa and colonizing other continents. And by 15,000 years ago, we have colonized the entire world with the exception of Antarctica. I'm just going to focus in on one of these paleo diets. I'm going to focus on this one here in ancient Mexico for the simple reason that I've actually worked there and have pictures. But this is what a wild landscape. This is from Gila Nikit's rock shelter. It's a very famous place. This is one of the earliest inhabited caves in Mexico. And it's also famous because it is extraordinary preservation of dietary remains, which include a very wide variety of plants and animals. This environment has actually not changed that much. This is much what it would have looked like 8,000 years ago or more. It's very different from what is recommended as paleo diet foods, as you can see here. It does not look very similar. If you were to look at what types of foods then people really would have eaten, they would have eaten a wide variety of wild plants. We find evidence of things like prickly pear, mesquite, which is a type of legume, wajes, which are another type of legume, nance fruit, huizaches, another type of legume. They liked legumes a lot, if you can't tell in this place, agaves, susi nuts, various beans, cucurbits, and then also seasonally available game, things like rabbits, deer, turtles, peccaries, and so forth. And so this was a really, really rich environment around September. But in April, almost all of those resources disappeared, and people would have moved into other locations that would have been more productive at that time of year. If we look together at many of the things that we can say, and we want to make some generalizations about what real Paleolithic diets were like, we can say that they were regionally variable. They varied depending on which continent you were on and where you were on that continent, what the local ecology was like. They were also seasonally variable. They changed throughout the year. Plants would come in and out of seasons. Herds would migrate. Fish would spawn. It was a constantly changing landscape. These people had high mobility. They had to move from food patch to exploit these resources. We run into a problem here, though. If the idea is that we need to live like our Paleolithic ancestors to live healthily, then we're in a serious trouble, because we have 7 billion people on this planet, and there is no way that we can feed that many people with those types of foods. And so this raised a question to my research group. We were really interested in knowing, is it really agriculture that has caused so many of these problems? Is agriculture itself, 10,000 years ago, is the invention of agriculture, what has really driven these chronic diseases? And so we've decided to investigate this question, and one of the ways we've done it is by looking at the microbiome, the gut microbiome. And I mentioned this study earlier. We compared the gut microbiota of natural populations that had very different subsistence strategies. We went out and we looked at hunter-gatherers, rural agriculturalists, and also urban industrialized peoples. We initially collected our samples from the United States, from Peru, from these different populations here, and then we combined them with some additional populations from the literature to round out our geographic scope. So we also had populations now from both Africa, South America, North America, and Europe. And they eat very differently. I should point out the 2 hunter-gatherer groups in here, which are the Matses and the Hadza of Tanzania. The Hadza of Tanzania primarily eat roots and tubers and honey and a small amount of game. The Hadza here primarily eat wild plantains, tubers, fish, and occasionally sloth. The rural agriculturalists are these 2 populations here. These are the Tunapuco of highland Peru. They eat a diet very rich in potatoes. Not a lot of diversity in that case. In rural Malawi, this is a diet that's a grain-based diet. And then, of course, we have our Italians with our more Mediterranean diet, and we have our, this is in Oklahoma, so you can imagine what that diet looks like. So what's really interesting, though, is if we put all this data together and we ask, is agriculture what separates these groups? Is there a difference in the gut microbiota of these groups, and does it separate between the hunters and gatherers and everyone else? And this is the results that we get. Instead, what we find is that all traditional peoples, regardless if they're hunting and gathering or if they're small-scale farmers, cluster together, have a very similar gut microbiome profile. Each one of these dots is an individual that summarizes the community structure of its gut microbiome. Whereas all urban industrialized populations cluster together over here. What we see is a huge difference, not with agriculture, but it seems to be industrialization that's really driving this. We can then look at the same data in a different way and talk about gut microbiome diversity. What we see is that urban industrialized societies have much lower microbial diversity than do traditional peoples. And this is really interesting because it's been shown that the richness of the microbiome is directly correlated with metabolic markers and metabolic health. So we know that people who are healthy and lean have on average higher microbial diversity than individuals who are obese. What's also really interesting is we can look into the archaeological record. You may not realize it, but feces does sometimes preserve in unusual circumstances, and we can go to these things called coprolites, and we can actually measure the microbial communities that are present, and we can compare them to these kind of reference populations from the present day. These are some examples here. One thing you'll immediately notice is they're extremely fibrous. This is true for virtually any archaeological feces you will ever find. Both of these are from the last 2,000 years. They're actually not that old. And what we find, which is really fascinating, is their microbial communities strongly resemble modern-day hunter-gatherers and small-scale agriculturalists. They do not look like urban industrialized peoples, despite the fact, for example, that this one right here comes from the Sassanid Empire and is part of a highly complex society. So I hope I've convinced you today that there is value in studying ancient diets, and I hope you've learned something about real ancient diets to use in your daily lives. So thank you very much.